We were discussing the law of bar mitzvah, which is Aramaic for the law of the neighbor, and basically in English, the right of first refusal. If somebody wants to sell their land to a stranger, the neighbor has the right to come in and buy out the stranger at the price that the stranger paid. So they paid $100 for the field, he can come and pay $100 for the field. That was the general law. The justification for this law, so the first thing we say, it's not a legal right. In other words, logically, you shouldn't have the right to do so because any person can come and buy. It's a free market. However, this is an exception to the rule where the sages are going to legislate and interfere with the market to legislate for what they would call, I don't want to call it the public good, but to legislate in order to do the good and just thing. They quote the verse in Deuteronomy from the Torah, which says, "V'asita hayashar v'hatov." You should do what is just and what is good. Now, the law can't be saying follow the verse. The sages explain the verse doesn't mean that you have to follow the law. You obviously have to follow the law. What this verse is saying is sometimes you have to do what is beyond the letter of the law, even though there's no obligation, but you should go beyond and help somebody. And therefore we, the court, the community uses their power to say, look, the neighbor only has one field neighboring him. The stranger can buy land anywhere. So we give the neighbor the right to purchase the field of his neighbor. Now, that's the basic law. But because obviously it's intrusive and there's some cost to pay from, there's a if you're helping one person, you're blocking somebody else. So for the next, the entire chapter really is, in some sense, it's limitations to this law. When does this law not apply? And by limiting this law and putting on the boundaries on this law, we understand when we finish the entire chapter, we will get the full picture of when this law applies. And between me and you also learn some loopholes, especially if you stick around for the next chapter, chapter 13. Then you also get some more loopholes. And then, like somebody told me yesterday, there's nothing you can't do. You just have to pay the right lawyer. Okay, so we're in chapter 12. I'm going to share the screen in case you're like me, which you have a big screen, not big, relatively big. Okay, so I'm going to start from the middle of 5. I know Vicky has the link too. It's the middle of 5. Middle of 5, and we read this paragraph, the top paragraph, the third paragraph in 5. We read it last time. We'll read it again, and I want to get to the cases that are after the second half of 5. And I also want to show how Maimonides, we always talk about Maimonides and how he derives the law from the Talmud, but he also has to interpret the Talmud. And case in point, we'll see today where the Talmud says something. The Talmud is vague. It's not clear what the Talmud is saying. Maimonides interprets the Talmud in a specific way, which leads to a specific legal result. Others, like Rashi, disagree. So here you see how the Talmud, even though everyone says we have to accept the Talmud is not a closed book. Even in the interpretation of the Talmud, there are great ramifications in the law. So let's read from the third paragraph. This practice means this idea of why we would say that the neighbor has the right to buy the land of his neighbor and get rid of the purchaser. In other words, the stranger who came to purchase the land. This practice stems from the charge, the commandment in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 18, and ye shall do what is just and good. That's the verse. V'asita hayashar v'hatov, do what is just and what is good. How was this explained? Our sages said, since the sale is fundamentally the same. In other words, the stranger who's buying land, for him, the land is the same. In other words, agriculture. How do they measure land in those days? How many potatoes it can produce? Okay, so where do you care where you purchase your potatoes? This acre, that acre, they're more or less the same for you. Since the sale is fundamentally the same, it is just and good that the property should be acquired by the neighbor instead of the person living farther away. Okay, so that's the biblical source for the rabbinic intervention into the workings of the economy. Okay, now we're going to get into a few technical issues. If there are many neighbors, all have the right to acquire the property which was sold. It is divided among them equally according to their number, and they all must reimburse the buyer for the purchase price. In other words, you have one field, you have 4 neighbors, they all want a piece of the pie, everybody wants to buy. And they say, well, I can't buy land elsewhere because the land elsewhere, I mean, I could, but it's going to be a greater burden because it's a benefit to have all my fields close to each other, touching each other. So I don't have to move my equipment. I don't have to move my tractors. I don't have to move my cows to plow, etc. So all the neighbors say, we all want a part of this field. So what you do is all neighbors have a right, and therefore you would divide the field into 4, if there are 4 neighbors, and they each have to reimburse the purchaser. They have to reimburse according to what they get. So if there are 4 neighbors and they each want a land, each one would give a quarter of the purchase price to the person, to the stranger, to the foreigner who bought the land. Okay, that is that's the first point. This applies provided they all come at the same time. If, however, one comes and purchases the property from the buyer, he alone acquires it, for he is a neighbor. This is very interesting. So let's say I have a field and I want to sell my field. I have 4 neighbors. If I sell my land to a foreigner, to a foreign person, then the neighbors can all come together and evict the foreign person by reimbursing him. And they each would have a equal share of the land being sold. But if I sell my land to one neighbor, then the other neighbors can come and say, we all want a part. Divide the land into quarters and give each neighbor a quarter. No. If I sold my land to one neighbor, the other neighbors are excluded. Why? Because you can't trigger this law of getting rid of the foreigner because the person I sold to is not a foreigner. So this is very interesting because some people are uncomfortable by this whole law because they're going to say it's going to artificially suppress the price of the purchase. And it may. I'm not denying that in some cases it will have that effect. But it's interesting that there still would be a competition amongst the neighbors, right? There'll be competition from the foreigner. If the neighbors actually, if it's really desirable and the neighbors actually would want the land of their neighbor, so within the neighborhood, there's going to be a bidding war. So there's going to be incentive for one of the neighbors to come up to me very quickly as soon as I put my for sale sign. One of the neighbors has an incentive to outdo all the neighbors, come to me first and offer me an offer I cannot refuse. So in that sense, once I sell it to a neighbor, the other neighbors are excluded. How come? Aren't they neighbors? And the logic is you have to sell to your neighbors? Yes, but you could sell to one neighbor because if I sold to that neighbor, I'm doing good to that neighbor and the other neighbors are excluded. So again, balance. We're doing the balance here. We still want some sense of competitive pricing. And therefore I don't know if that's the reason, but I think that's the result of this detail of the law. Similarly, if some of the neighbors comes and purchase it and others are in a distant country, those who are present are entitled to purchase it and it becomes theirs. So it's not just one neighbor. If I sell to one, all others are excluded. If I sell to a few, all others are excluded. Even if they say we were out of town, had we been here, we would have made an offer. Too bad. If you're not here, you lose. And you will see this notion is going to repeat itself. Because later on, also later in the chapter or in the next chapter, I don't remember if it's 12 or 13, but what we're going to see is that the only way the neighbor could trigger his right of first refusal is if he shows up to the court immediately paying cash. He can't say, oh, I want to buy your field, I want to evict the neighbor, but I have to wait till my grandmother comes from Australia and she gives me a check, or I have to wait till my bank approves the loan in 30 days. It doesn't work that way because again, there's too much. We have to balance. We don't want too much of a burden on the seller. right? If you make it too difficult, if you make it too easy for the neighbor to trigger his right of first refusal, then you're making it harder for me to sell. So we have to balance these ideas. So you'll see later that the right of the neighbor to trigger his right of first refusal has to be immediate. He can't delay, and he has to come with cash. And in that sense, in this scenario where I sell my land to two of my neighbors, the other two are out of town, then the two of them that are here get the land, and they don't have to divide it into four. They could divide it into two. Go ahead. Go ahead, Vicky.
I had a quick question about the priority of the transaction. Let's say the foreigner comes first and buys it. And what about the price? Whether is it going to be the same even if the first neighbor, he saw the for sale sign and he decided to purchase, so he needs to pay the market price, right? And also the priority. If the foreigner buys first, then how long, how much time how quickly the neighbor should react?
So we'll start with the second answer. The second answer is immediately. I don't know if it means an hour or a day. We'll see later, but I don't remember the exact number, but you cannot wait a month. You can't wait a year. You can't say I was on vacation. I just got back from Florida and I'm evicting the neighbor. You can't do that. You have to show up immediately with the cash. Now, your first question is a little bit more complicated. You say, the neighbor has to pay market price, but what is market price? We don't know what market price is. So the neighbor has to pay whatever the foreigner paid. The question becomes, I'm not an economist, so I can't answer this question. The question becomes, what would that system do to the market, to real estate prices? And there's an argument to make that it would suppress the prices. It would make the prices low. Why? Because the neighbor who really wants his neighbor's land is not motivated to give a high offer, because all he has to do is wait with his hands folded, wait till a foreigner comes and makes a price and makes an offer, makes a sale, and then he could sweep in and get the land for that same price. So why would he, who really wants the land, why would he give a higher price? That's one way to look at it. But there's another way to look at it. The other way to look at it is if the foreigner wants to enter this community, he's going to pay over market price to disincentivize the neighbor from buying him out. So in that sense, there's a pressure. This law could actually raise the price in some scenarios. Also, that's what I said last time we studied, five weeks ago. So I don't expect you to remember it offhand. It's been 5 weeks. But also what we add this time is that there's also going to be a built-in pressure amongst the neighbors. The for sale sign goes up. I know that if I wait around for a foreigner to come and make an offer, foreigner, I don't mean someone from a different country. Foreigner, I mean someone who's not immediately bordering this field. I'm just using that as a term, right? A stranger, right? Somebody who's more distant shows up. If I wait for someone who's more distant to show up to make an offer, and then I'm going to counter, and then I'm going to buy it, take it away from them at that offer, what's going to happen is my other neighbor will swoop in and get the whole field. So I'm incentivized to give a higher offer immediately. So the bottom line is, like I said, I don't have a computer here. I can't run the numbers. I don't have all the facts. I don't know what this will do to a price. Most importantly, I am not an economist. I don't think the Talmud is making a claim that this has no effect whatsoever. But I think that there are counter pressures here. So it's probably every market is different. And depending if there's COVID or if it's the first wave or if it's the Delta variant, everything plays in. So I don't know that I have all the answers, but I think it's not just simplistic that this law will only put pressure downward. There are other incentives that may pick up the pressure, raise the price in certain scenarios, in certain scenarios. So the short answer is I don't know.
Well, no, your answer is very good. I mean, the Talmudic answer is very good because the timing is the issue. Whoever gets first, right? So whoever needs it first probably should react first.
Right.
And that's in the case, if it's a neighbor, then we don't need a buyer, and the buyer.
Right. So let me.
He's willing to pay a good price. That's what I mean.
Right. Okay. Let's learn another case, because this is the case that I really want to show you. Not that it's the most interesting, but it's the most interesting from my perspective, because this is, you see here how Maimonides is not just quoting from the Talmud, but Maimonides is he's also interpreting, and you'll see how he learns different than somebody else. And what you will see, but different than Rashi, and what you will see is Maimonides is, I believe, what is he doing? He's shutaf. He's limiting the right of first refusal. He's limiting the neighbor's right to evict. So when he has a choice, he would limit it. I don't know if that's his motivation, but I'm just saying, as an outsider, reading the debate between Rashi and Rambam, I see that Maimonides, Rambam, is the one who limits this right of the neighbor. So here's the scenario. So this is the final line, the final paragraph of 5. Similarly, if a person sells a property to one neighbor or one of his business partners, now, what I'm about to read, this is the words of Maimonides. This highlighted area. In other words, this is Maimonides' interpretation. Even if he is not a partner in the ownership of landed property, I don't know what landed property means. It means this property. That person acquires it. The other partners or neighbors do not have the right to acquire together with him. What is happening here? What's happening here is like this. Maimonides says, let's say I have a business partner. We're in the, I don't know, we're not in the real estate business. We are in the shmata business. We're in the garment business, okay? So you're my partner, we're in the garment business. I want to sell my land. In that case, if I sell my land to the partner in the garment business, the neighbor can evict my partner. Why not? It's a very strange law. Why not? Because it seems that what we're saying is, I'm selling it to my friend. If he's my partner, it's a good policy for people to do kindness to their partners, right? In other words, yes, you want to be kind to your neighbor. In other words, your neighbor has an inherent connection to the land. He's the neighbor, so he's got certain rights. But Maimonides is saying, quoting the Talmud, that if you sell to a partner, the neighbors cannot come and take it away. Why is this so interesting? Because this is an interpretation of a Talmud. What do I mean? The Talmud just says that the law of the neighbor does not apply to a partner. But the Talmud does not explain what it means when it says a partner. And therefore, Rashi, who's one of the primary commentators of the Talmud, Rashi says that what the Talmud is saying is that if Rashi says that is what that the Talmud is saying is that if we have two partners who are partnering in the same field, in other words, me and Vicky own the same field, and I want to sell my half to Vicky. In that case, the neighbor can't buy my part, because you are the partner with me in this field.
Even if you're a foreigner, if you're a stranger, if you're out of town?
So it depends what it, yeah, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. The answer is that a partner, if I sell to my partner, the neighbor cannot take it away from my partner. The question
and your partner is your neighbor, or he could be from different area?
That's the question. That's exactly the question. Well, he doesn't have to be your neighbor. No. Let's say I have a partner who lives in Australia.
Okay.
And if I sell to my partner, the neighbor, I'm selling my land in Greenwich, I'm selling it to my partner in Australia, the neighbor cannot take it away.
Got it.
The question is, what do I mean when I say a partner in Australia? Does it mean that my partner has shared ownership of the land in Greenwich, this land, this piece of real estate that we're talking about? So he's got some connection to this land already. I'm just selling my half to him. That's Rashi. Rambam, Maimonides, says no. He says we can be in an unrelated business. He's in Australia and we're selling potatoes in New Zealand. And that's our partnership. Nevertheless, because I have a connection to him and he's my friend and we were business partners, if I choose to sell my property in Greenwich, which he has no connection to, and he's a foreigner in Greenwich, nevertheless, my Greenwich neighbor cannot evict him. So Maimonides is expanding the limitation on right of first refusal. In other words, Maimonides is expanding the definition of a partner. Rashi says that when the Talmud says that the right of first refusal does not apply to a neighbor, to a partner, Rashi says it's talking about a partner who shares your ownership of this piece of land. So it's much more limiting. Rambam expands it. Rambam says, let's go back to the words of the Rambam. Let's go back to the words of Maimonides. And this is his own words. You see? So he says, the end of 5, so let's read it again. Similarly, if a person sells a property to one neighbor or one of his business partners, even if he is not a partner in the ownership of landed property, in other words, he's not a partner in his real estate, he's only a partner in he's only a partner in commerce. Nevertheless, that person acquires it. The other partners or neighbors do not have the right to acquire it together with him. So the way I read this, I'm reading this and saying that Maimonides has a choice. He has a choice to say, when the Talmud says partner and saying that the right of first refusal does not apply to a partner, the question becomes, are we going to think about partner in the broad sense, or are we going to think about it in the limited sense? And Maimonides is broadening the definition of partner, which the Talmud does not state explicitly, so we have no idea what the Talmud meant. But the Talmud is broadening the definition of partner, and by doing so, he's limiting the law of the right of first refusal. That's how I see it. I may be wrong.
Oh, it looks like Maimonides is trying to explain to us what it means to be just and good.
Right.
Because that's a very broad definition from Deuteronomy, and we're still trying to define what's just and good. Yes. So Maimonides kind of helps us to understand, to broaden the definition of who is your partner, how do you have to treat your business partners, your neighbors, and people in general.
Right. So this is very interesting, because the question is, you have to be nice to your neighbors. You have to be nice to your business partners, right? So which one is more dominant? So I don't have to say which one. As long as you're doing good in some sense, the other people can claim and say, do good to us, because I'm doing the right thing to my other friend. So just like when we said we have 4 neighbors, if you sell to one, the other ones are excluded, because it's not about the neighbors have no right. It's very hard to define exactly the parameters of this law, because it's not exactly stated. But the point is, if I'm doing good in one sense, the other person who wants to evoke this obligation to do good can't do it. In other words, it's only if I'm selling it to a foreigner, a stranger, who I have no connection to, then the people who have already an inherent, a deeper connection to me could come in and say, what about us? But if I sell to one brother or one partner, the other partners can't show up. If I sell to one neighbor, the other neighbors can't come and interfere. If I sell to a foreigner, the other guy's saying, we're your neighbors for 40 years. Why don't you sell to us? But now Maimonides says, I could even sell it to the guy in Australia who's not even a citizen of this country, doesn't pay taxes in town, doesn't matter. The point is, if he's my business partner, then it's a nice thing. If you're going to sell land, sell it to your business partner. Be a mensch.
And what about relatives, not business partners?
So that's a good question. That is a very good question. I think Maimonides mentioned relative. Let me see.
Yeah, because we're trying to define the circle of people who priorities.
I'm gonna refrain from answering that right now, because I don't know for sure. But as far as I can see, you can't sell it to your relative. But what you could do, it's very interesting. In chapter 13, you say it doesn't apply to a gift. If I want to gift my land to anybody, to a relative or to a stranger, if I want to gift my land to anybody, I'm allowed to. Why? So we'll see later that the logic that we can't apply this law. You can't apply the law of the right of first refusal to a gift. Why? How does the logic of the right of first refusal work? So we saw it in Maimonides. Maimonides says, we tell the foreigner, listen, foreigner, for you, all land is the same. So why do you have to buy in my block? Buy in a different block. But that doesn't work by a gift, because what am I going to say? I'm going to say, Menachem wants to give me a gift. So what are we going to tell him? You don't need Menachem's gift. Get somebody else's gift. Nobody else is gifting me $1 million of real estate, right? So when it comes to a gift, it doesn't work. So you see what we're doing here. We're saying, yes, I want to try to appease the neighbors, but we also want the owner to have the right to gift land to whoever he wants to. So this is all, again, we're not going to be able to get a full picture until we get all the exceptions piled on together, and then we get sort of more of a gift. But it's an excellent question about a relative. I don't think that the relative who's not a partner and is not a neighbor, I don't think I could sell it to my relative and deny. I don't think a sale to a relative would bar the neighbors from evoking the right of first refusal, but I reserve the right to say that I'm wrong and that I missed the point and it's written clearly and I should have known it and I don't know it. But for today, I don't think the relative can do it.
But
you answered that because, I think you answered that because if you give a gift to the relative, then it supersedes everything else. That's the answer.
But not only relative, I can give a gift to a stranger.
Or
that's
even
interesting law.
Right.
If you're giving a gift, it doesn't apply to gifts. A gift, I have the right to give to whoever I want. Sale, yes, I have the right to sell to everybody. It's very interesting the way the law is classified. The way the law is classified is I don't have an obligation. The obligation to do good is not upon the seller. The obligation to do good is upon the buyer. In other words, we told the buyer, what do you care? Go somewhere else. Go to the next block. But the seller, it's my land. I can sell it to whoever I want. I can gift it to whoever I want. When do we say the neighbor could get rid of the foreign buyer? If he can buy the equivalent land elsewhere. But with a gift, it won't work.
It gives a leeway of what is a gift, where you have some kind of compensation when you're giving someone your land. It's tricky. It's not that simple.
Correct. So it's very interesting that this is something that is so important that the Talmud tries to root out the fraud. Okay. Mm-hmm. In the next chapter, you're going to say there's a difference between a gift. Okay. There's a difference between a gift and very, very interesting. Today, you want to make, there's something called when I sell my land, I'm basically, when I sell my land to you, I take responsibility for the title. In other words, if I sell my land to you and for whatever reason, you're evicted from the land because I did not have proper title, you come back to the original owner and you say, reimburse me. That's a whole nother system of law. Remember, there was no title insurance, right? So if you're going to put all your life savings to buy a house for me, and then it turns out that I don't really own the land because the land is mortgaged to somebody else, and it turns out that you had no way of knowing that, the bottom line is when there's a sale, the seller always is what comes along with what they call achrayut, responsibility. You could, if you lose the land because of a problem with the title, you can come back to the original owner and get your money back. Typically, when you gift somebody, I won't give you that level of achrayut, that level of responsibility, right? I'm not gonna give you my land and then say that if you lose that land, if that land is taken away from you, I'm gonna pay you $1 million. I don't have $1 million. So in number 13, you'll see, next chapter, you'll see what happens if I write a document and I say, I'm gifting this land to a stranger, and you know what? And I'm taking responsibility, and I'm gonna back up this title. So the Talmud says, no, that's fraud. In other words, we don't believe you that it was a gift. We believe it was a sale, and you're just writing a gift to avoid the right of first refusal. Why do we think it's a gift? Why do we think it's a sale? Because the seller wrote that the seller is taking responsibility for the title. You don't take responsibility for a title for a gift. So what I'm trying to say, Zina, is that you're right. We're going to look at that contract, and if it looks too fishy, we're going to look for, maybe there was a transaction here, maybe there was a sale. But you're right, it's not always easy to detect the difference between a gift and a sale. You're 100% right.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay, we'll learn one more exception. We started a little late, so we'll do another few minutes. We'll do one more exception, and this is very interesting. What happens if I own land in 5 different states, so in 5 different counties? I have a bunch of pieces of land. I want to sell, I want to liquidate. I want to get into the stock market because I think now is a good time to buy stocks. So whatever it is, I want cash. So I want to liquidate. So I want to sell all my land to one person. If I sell all my land to one person, those various neighbors cannot show up and say, oh, we want to buy our neighboring land. They can't do it. Why? Because because those neighbors are not the equivalent of this buyer. This buyer is willing to buy all my land. If you're going to give that buyer a hard time, he's not going to buy all my land. Some of the neighbors will evoke the right of first refusal. Some of the neighbors will buy my land, but some won't. In other words, you're making it much harder for me to sell all my land to many different buyers. So in other words, you also have to do what's just and good to the seller. And in this case, if I want to sell multiple lands and I have one buyer for multiple lands in multiple areas, that is a kindness to the seller to allow him to make that transaction because it's a complicated transaction. And if it's a complicated transaction, there's not going to be somebody else. The other neighbors don't claim to say, we want to buy all your fields. Some of the neighbors are saying we want some of our fields. Even if all the neighbors, even if every land I sell, those neighbors want it, I have to go write 5 contracts. Too complicated. So again, another limitation to the right of first refusal, if I'm selling all my assets, multiple, it's not the all. If I'm selling multiple assets, it says all, it's a question if it's all or some.
Yeah, it's a question. It's a question, all or.
So let me check what the commentaries say. I'll check. I have a book here with Maimonides with commentaries. I'll look at it in a second. But first, let's just read the law in the Hebrew, in the original, and then we'll see what the commentaries say. When a person sells all his properties to one person, in other words, I have multiple properties in different land, in different areas, they're not touching, but I'm selling it to one person. A person whose property borders on one of the fields that were sold does not have the right to displace the purchaser from that field, for he purchased it and the other fields at once. In other words, if you're the buyer and you're buying multiple lands at once, the neighbors can't bother you. So that's
but not all. Not all. Suppose I have 10 properties and sell only 9 to
so let me check. Let me see if my guess is that my book is going to address that, even though Maimonides does not address it explicitly. Give me a second. I'll see if I can find it.
Should probably be the same.
I would argue that, yeah.
If it's the same, it will lead to some strange things too. Suppose I have only 2 properties.
Right.
And I'm selling one and say I sell all my properties but one to one buyer. That's tricky again.
Yeah, but you can make that exception. More than 1, more than 2, more than 3.
Okay, I have to look at it more carefully, but it seems that most people believe that it applies to, it doesn't have to be all my fields. It applies to, I'm selling 2 fields, at least 2 fields. So why does Maimonides say all? So those commentaries say it's talking about a person who has 2 fields. So all is minimum of 2. But I'm not 100% sure if anyone disagrees with that. I'll give you just one second. I'm going to read it again more carefully. Yeah, so it seems like most people believe that it doesn't mean all, it means multiple. So again, if I'm selling to 2 people, if I'm selling 2 different lands and 2 different lands that has 2 different neighbors, and one of the neighbors want to stop the sale and want to buy it back from me, We say, no, sorry, neighbor, you can't stop the foreigner from coming into your neighborhood. Why? Why not? It's what do I care that you're also selling something elsewhere? Because we have to take also into consideration the benefit of the seller. And selling multiple lands, finding a buyer who is willing to buy multiple lands, that's harder. It's harder to do. And if you make it too complicated and you tell that buyer, sorry, the neighbor, you're buying multiple lands, but the neighbor may take away some of them, then it's, also factors into the price. If you think about it, Maimonides doesn't say it, but it factors into the price. If I'm buying multiple lands from you, so you're going to discount me the price, right? And you're going to give me the better land, you'll give me. In other words, the fact that I'm buying a few factors into the price. So now what are you going to do? You're going to say, let that other person buy only one piece of land. I only gave you that piece of land at that price because you're buying my other lands. So it's going to be very complicated to undo this package. And now, so Maimonides doesn't give that reason, but I think that's another reason. But Maimonides' reason is simply you have to do good with the seller as well. And the seller we can't have the seller have too much of a loss. And if you complicated this transaction, you're going to scare away the buyer, and the seller is now going to have to sell 5 different parcels of land, which becomes very, very complicated. And in no way does taking that damage to the seller into consideration with the good of the neighbor. Doing good to the seller in this scenario outweighs the good to the neighbor. So all I'm trying to say is that we have this principle, but the Talmud wants to apply it as carefully as possible. And what we saw today is even when the Talmud says it doesn't apply to a neighbor, now the post-Talmudic sages, it doesn't apply to a partner. There's still room. Baruch Hashem, thank God that Jews can still argue. Even when the Talmud says it doesn't apply to a neighbor, to a partner, thank God we could still argue and say, what is the definition of a partner? Is it a partner that is a partner that owner with me in this land? Or is it a partner who is owner who's partner in unrelated business, in merchandise? So again, Maimonides, like we said, is limiting the right of the neighbor by expanding the definition of partner.
Okay.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So again, we're trying to define what's just and good on both ends.
Correct. We have to you cannot do good to one. Zach said this last time, and I think he phrased it very well. You can't do good to one person without harming somebody else. So you're right. You agree. The question is how much harm and how much good. So you need to look at the full picture. You can't just look at one piece. You have to look at the whole picture and then say, yes, I understand I'm doing some harm to other people, but does the good doing to A, does that justify the harm doing to B? And if the harm to B is too great, then sorry, we're not going to do good to A, even though we'd like to do good to A, because we cannot ignore that the harm to B is too strong. So I think it teaches us to look at the full picture and not to zero in and say, I want to help this guy and ignore everything else. Sometimes you have to help this guy, but you also have to be cognizant of the unintended consequences to the people around you. And this is case in point. Sometimes we're going to say, sorry, we're putting the good to A on hold, even though usually we like to do good to A. We're not letting you evoke that. We're not going to do good to A because here the pain to B is going to be too profound. So this is the story in short. Thank you very much for joining. And yeah, this is fun. I enjoy it. So thank you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Do well.
Bye.